Chuck Colson was known as the hitman in Richard Nixon's White House. He was the man, the go-to man that he could count on to get the job done, no matter what it was. After Colson helped Nixon get reelected in 1972, Colson left the job as counsel to the president and returned to his old law firm. But he felt empty. Something was missing. And when he met with one of his old clients, he immediately saw what that something was in that other man.
And then I went to Boston one day after I left the White House, and I went back to my law firm, had a meeting with the president of Raytheon, one of the largest corporations in America, because I was once again to be their counsel. I'd been counsel before I went to the White House, and I was coming back to be counsel again. And Tom Phillips, the president, just seemed so different. He was calm and he was peaceful, and we had a great conversation, and he started asking me about me and my family and how I was weathering in Watergate. I said, Tom, you've changed. What's happened to you? He said, yes, I've accepted Jesus Christ and committed my life to him. He kind of looked away when he did that, almost like he was embarrassed to say it. But he shocked me. I mean, I took a firm grip on the bottom of the chair. I'd never heard anyone say something like that boldly.
I'm Dennis Rainey with Inspiring Courageous Faith. And you're going to hear a story today, a compelling story, one of the best I've ever heard of redemption. And I've heard a lot of them. It's about a young man who was involved in the Watergate scandal back in 1972 through 74. He was working for the White House and with full knowledge and direction of President Richard Nixon and his key staff committed federal crimes for which he was imprisoned for a number of years because he tried to cover them up. One of the key figures in the scandal was Chuck Colson, but his life took a different turn. I remember hearing about his conversion in prison when he made it public that he had received Christ as his Savior and Lord. Like many others back then, I had some skepticism whether this was truly real. But sure enough, Chuck Colson was born again. He was a new creation in Jesus Christ. After spending 7 months in prison, that experience led him to start Prison Fellowship, which was one of the most significant ministries to prisoners around the world. He wrote a book called Born Again, which became a nationwide bestseller. I met Chuck Colson a number of years ago when he came to Little Rock to be on my radio show, Family Life Today. And we did an interview with Chuck, but after we did the interview, we invited him to go to my house and have my famous blackened salmon dish. And I told Chuck, I knew he had his own recipe for fish that he liked. It was Chilean sea bass. And I said, I'm sorry, Chuck, yours is in second place to mine. Come to my house tonight and you'll find out why. So he did. We had a delightful meal. And by the way, just the stories he told about the White House and what it was like to work there during the Nixon administration were fascinating. But after he finished his blackened salmon meal, he shook his head and he said, you know, Dennis, my Chilean sea bass is really good, but your blackened salmon is right up there with it. And he had promised me to get together with me later on in South Florida. But I'll tell you about this a bit later. Chuck had a more important meeting. Now listen to this broadcast with my co-host Bob Lapine, where we interviewed Chuck and heard the story of God's redemptive work in his life. You write in your book called The Good Life, you mentioned that this book is like looking in a rearview mirror.
Yeah, it is.
And you're looking back over how you describe a tumultuous life. And you know, if you would have said that to me 25 years ago, Chuck, I'd have said, well, yeah, maybe you, because of where you came from, being with Nixon and in the White House and going to prison and all the fallout of making national news with a crime. But you know what? now I understand what you mean. Life is tumultuous, and looking back over it, we can live a good life if we have our hope in the right place.
Yeah, it's true. Everybody thinks that you can go through life and it's a breeze. People who haven't had a major crisis in life, people who haven't fallen on their face, just have to wait for their turn, because it will happen. You think you got life all together, the world rolls over on top of you.
There's a scene that I think really sets the stage for your book, and it's early in the book, but it tells the story of how you got together with a group of people and announced your conversion. Said there was polite applause, and you were near some bay or some sound, and a man was. I love the way you described it. He was leaning back with a cocktail in his hand, and he basically said, "Mr. Colson, as you can see, all of us here have lived a good life.
Yeah, right.
We have it all." It was evidently people who owned yachts and 3 and 4 homes around the world.
It was Hope Sound in Florida, which is one of the watering spots for the truly rich and famous and wealthy from all over the world.
Yeah.
And this woman, who's a lovely, beautiful Christian woman, took her backyard, which looks over the bay, and the bay was full of beautiful 70, 80, 100-foot yachts. And she put a tent out, and she had a 5 o'clock party, and everybody came in their white dinner jackets and long gowns because they were heading off to different parties for the evening. And I gave my testimony because she had arranged it this way. I would give my testimony and then take questions and answers. I gave my testimony, and most people were looking away, or they had this studied indifference about them. They didn't want to appear to be affected by it. All the questions were then about Watergate, Nixon, the presidency, prison. And just as it was getting ready to get over, and it was not an easy experience. Just as it was about to end, this man leaning against the tent pole, legs crossed, cocktail in one hand, looks at me and says, "Mr. Colson, you had this dramatic experience going from the White House to prison, but what are you going to say to the rest of us here?" He said, "You can see," and he sweeps his hand over looking at the bay, "you can see that we have the good life. We don't have these kind of problems." I said, "Well, you may not have had them yet. You will. If there's anybody here who's really had a life without problems, I'd sure like to talk to him afterwards, because everybody has their share of problems, and if you don't now, you will when you're lying on your deathbed, and all of these things will have no meaning to you because you know your life's about to end." It was like letting air out of a bellows. I mean, it just whoosh. You could feel people exhaling. There wasn't a sound. Nobody applauded. The hostess got up and said, "Well, make yourselves comfortable, and Mr. Colson will stay and answer questions." And I had a stream of people, and my wife did as well.
Right.
And we did a dinner that night, coming up telling me my son is on drugs and I can't find him, and my husband's got 4 mistresses. I don't know how to deal with it. I mean, it was just a never-ending series of problems. There's one study I cite in the book that finds that, empirically finds that people can become content and happy at a middle-class lifestyle. Money in excess of that doesn't do anything. It does not increase their happiness by any measure, and very often creates unhappiness.
Mm-hmm. You know, there is a generation of our listeners who really have never heard the story of how you came to faith in Christ. So to set the stage for how this book has come about, how your Ecclesiastes began to be written, take us back to the White House. You were working for President Nixon, mm-hmm. had one of the most prestigious jobs there. You were a powerful man, mm-hmm. An attorney. You and your wife Patty were raising your family at the time.
Were you counsel to the president? Was that your
special counsel to the president? Yes, and I was in the office. As a matter of fact, my office was immediately next to his, in his working office in the executive office building, and we were very close. I was one of the 4 or 5 people closest to the president. I really came up with a strategy for the 1972 campaign, which was a landslide victory for the president, historic landslide victory, as a matter of fact. And when the election was over, that night, as a matter of fact, when the voting was taking place, Nixon had me and Bob Haldeman, just 2 of us, in his office. We sat there until 2 in the morning. Patty and my kids were in my office waiting for me. And he's toasting me with all the vote results coming in and talking about the fact that I've made his presidency and I can do anything I want, win the cabinet, go practice law, and I'd make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, which I'd done before I'd gone to the White House. So I really had life made. And the next morning I woke up feeling miserable. And for 2 or 3 months, I would sit in my office and look out over the beautiful manicured lawns of the south lawn of the White House and think about, boy, this is pretty good. You know, grandson of immigrants comes to this country, rises to the top, earns a scholarship to college, had been a success at everything ever done. And here I am, and what's it all about? And had this incredible period of emptiness. And then I went to Boston one day after I left the White House and I went back to my law firm. Had a meeting with the president of Raytheon, one of the largest corporations in America, because I was once again to be their counsel. I'd been counsel before I went to the White House. Now I was coming back to be counsel again. And Tom Phillips, the president, just seemed so different. He was calm and he was peaceful, and we had a great conversation. And he started asking me about me and my family and how I was weathering in Watergate. I said, Tom, you've changed. What's happened to you? He said, yes, I've accepted Jesus Christ and committed my life to him. He kind of looked away when he did that, almost like he was embarrassed to say it. But he shocked me. I mean, I took a firm grip on the bottom of the chair. I'd never heard anyone say something like that boldly.
Now, wait a second. You hadn't grown up in the church then?
Oh, no. I'd been in church twice a year, if that, and would say I was a Christian because I grew up in America and it's a Christian country and I wasn't Jewish, so I must be a Christian. I had no idea what a Christian was. No clue. And he said to me, I've given my life to Jesus Christ. It was shocking words. But over those next several months, I began to think about that conversation and wonder what he really meant and why he was so peaceful and why his personality had changed so dramatically. And so in the summer of 1973, in the darkest days of Watergate, world caving in, I went back and spent an evening on his porch of his home outside of Boston, hot August night, and he witnessed to me, told me what had happened to him. Told me his story, an amazing story. And he also read to me a chapter out of C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity, about the great sin, pride. And it was me Lewis was writing about. And I realized my life, I thought was idealistic. I was trying to do all these things for my family. I was trying to serve my country. It was all about me. And it was pride. And that I didn't give in. He wanted to pray with me, and he led a prayer, but I didn't.
You resisted.
I resisted, sure. I'm too proud. Big-time Washington lawyer and friend of the President of the United States.
You didn't want to bow to anybody, huh?
That's right. And I went out to get into my automobile and start to drive away and got about 100 yards and had to stop the car. I was crying too hard. Called out to God. I said, come into my life. If this is true, if I want to know you, I want to be forgiven. And that was the night that Jesus came into my life. Nothing's been the same since. Nothing can ever be the same again. The world all scoffed, as you guys noted at the beginning of the program. But it was okay. I persevered, and my faith really sustained me through prison. And then I saw a mission in life. And, of course, that's the great paradox. One of the things I talk about in this book is that everything about life is a paradox. It's not the way it appears. And we get this idea about what's good in life, but what turns out to be best for us is the thing we least expect or maybe don't want. The greatest thing that ever happened in my life was going to prison. Thank God for Watergate. Thank God for what happened to me. Because I went through this, I've discovered what life is really all about. And that's what I write it in here, basically what I've discovered life is all about.
Mm-hmm.
You actually said that in a 60 Minutes interview.
I did. Yeah.
And Mike Wallace, it stunned him that you said that. Thank God for Watergate.
He stopped the interview. That was on the 20th anniversary of Watergate, and he was sitting on my porch at home. He brought his camera crew, and Mike and I had been pretty good friends, actually, through the years. And he was sitting there, and I said, yeah, I thank God for Watergate. He was at a loss for words, and they stopped, and when you saw that on the screen, there was a break at that point because he didn't know how to respond to that.
Your spiritual malaise, though, really came before Watergate was a news story.
Oh, yeah. It was the fact that I'd done everything, and I was 41 years old. I'd ended up in the office next to the president. I grew up in very humble circumstances. I earned scholarships. I went into the Marines, became the youngest company officer for a brief period in the Marine Corps. Youngest administrative assistant in the United States Senate. Went through law school at night, which was a tremendously difficult thing to do. And, here I am. I've done everything. Built a law firm, great success. And I couldn't see what life was about. you get to the point, is this all it is? There's got to be more to life than this. And I think every human being arrives at that point. When they do, a lot of people will go and take a drink and try to make that feeling go away. Mm-hmm. Or they'll take some pills, or they're getting drugs, or they'll go have an affair. But those are nagging questions in the life of every human being. And I think what we Christians have to do today, I think it's really a difficult period because we live in a time, what's called postmodernism, which means there is no truth, everything is relative. You can't trust anything you read because all it is the opinion of the person who wrote it. So there's no standards, no yardsticks, nothing to measure your life by. It's pure drifting in the vapor. And what I'm saying to people is, that's where the secular world is. And if we hit them with the Bible, they're going to turn away. They're just going to say, oh, here comes one of these people preaching at us, or this is the Bible Belt. But if you start talking about the meaning of their lives and where they're going to find fulfillment in life, you can engage them.
Well, and we can be seduced as believers by the cultural message which says you will find meaning and purpose and fulfillment. I think materialism is the greatest seductress of our day, don't you?
Absolutely. And it gets into the church. It seeps into the church. It's almost impossible for it not to affect Christians because you can't turn on the radio, look at a billboard, pick up a newspaper, magazine. So we Christians absorb all this stuff. And then we kind of give it a little bit of a holy varnish by saying, well, we're really Christians, and, Sunday morning at least I'm going to be devoted to Christ. So we get affected by this. Yeah, we got to look at ourselves at our values.
Chuck, there's a scene that you paint vividly in your book. You've just been picked up by the federal marshals. You're being taken to this prison that was anything but like the White House.
Yeah, right.
I mean, you describe it well of how musty and the paint.
It wasn't a country club like everybody said it was?
Well, it's interesting. People say that about prisons, minimum security prisons, but I've never found anybody trying to get in.
You describe that scene, though, of driving along with those federal marshals. You just left your family. And you describe a peace, a lack of fear.
Yeah.
Now, I have to ask you, was it your newfound faith in Christ that was the basis of you moving toward 3 years of incarceration?
Yes. You go through something like Watergate where you pick up the newspaper every day and hear these charges made about you and headlines and screaming headlines, people saying outrageous things. You're in the middle of a battle for your life. It just totally absorbs you. It's very hard on the family. And so all of a sudden I've made the decision. I pled guilty. I got my sentence. I'm going off to prison, and on the ride to the prison, I was kind of, I'm relieved. It's over. In fact, I slept, first night in prison, I slept better than I slept at home in months because I knew what I had to do, and I knew what I was going to have to face, and I knew it was going to be tough, but I knew that Jesus would sustain me.
Do you remember when Timothy McVeigh was executed, and he read as his final statement in life the poem Invictus, which ends with, I am the captain of my own destiny. Do you think most people think that is the what life is all about?
Well, I think a lot of people would say that because I would have said that before I was converted. And that's a statement of pride. And in the case of Timothy McVeigh, it was insufferable arrogance. He was captain of his own ship, master of his own destiny. He could control life. That was Nietzsche. The will to power. You can will yourself to this position. And a lot of people imbibe that because they think that's what they're supposed to think. Deep down inside, no. They know they need things. One of the great studies I cited in this book was done at Dartmouth. And it discovered that human beings are wired, literally, the way we are genetically disposed, the way our brains work. We are wired to connect. In other words, we don't live alone. We live in community, we live with family, we live with friends, we live in a nation. And secondly, we're wired for God. We are actually searching for a meaningful relationship with the one who created us. Whether we acknowledge it or not, and most people out of pride won't acknowledge it, just like I wouldn't, but I was so desperately hungry. And as soon as I let those defenses go, that guard go down that night in the driveway in that flood of tears, sure, it came to me. So I'm trying to walk people through that same question in this book.
Reason can only take us so far.
Right.
Faith is what finishes the connection between the human soul
Exactly.
and God.
Exactly.
And what you've attempted to do is exhort us to come to the truth. And one of the things I want you to comment on, you just alluded to it briefly a few moments ago. You say that today there is no such thing as reality, or capital T, truth,
Right.
in our culture today. And I think for the average mom and dad who are raising kids, I don't think they realize, Chuck, what a battleground this is around truth.
This is the battleground. This is the battleground. Is there any reality? Is there any ultimate reality?
Or is it just opinion?
Yeah, is it just your preference versus my preference? And that's what they're being taught in college. Look at popular culture. The Matrix, the film The Matrix. What the story of The Matrix is all about is that life is nothing but the projection of a computer. And we're simply the product of a computer projection on a screen. Or they get Eastern religions. Eastern religions mean that we don't really exist. We are just a dream in the mind of God. Or they get to a campus or high schools and they're taught that we arose as single plant cells out of the primordial soup. So how can there be any? The element reality is that we're an accident. Or the element reality is we don't exist. So only one way of understanding life, that is, we were created by God, gives you an anchor in ultimate reality. The job is to find it, but, Dennis, you hit the nail on the head. You get to the point where you can prove it. I've gotten so convinced of the truth of the biblical worldview as applied in life against any other worldview that my great dream, as I write in The Good Life, my great dream is someday to be able to stand in the Supreme Court, every lawyer's dream, and argue his case in the Supreme Court. And I'm convinced if I could argue the case that the biblical worldview is the only one that conforms to reality, that I would win that case hands down, intellectually, by reason, by arguments, by logic. But that doesn't get you to God. As a matter of fact, sometimes the more you know, the tougher it gets. I tell a story in the book about a professional man, a lawyer who came to me and said he had studied everything, studied all Calvin's institutes from start to finish, read all the great theologians, but he said, I'm not saved. I said, well, you got to give yourself in faith. He said, but I can't, because I can't prove that this is all true. He had gotten so wrapped up in the mind that he lost the capacity for faith. He got by it. But the fact is, the case for God is, to me, incontrovertible. But it doesn't get you a relationship with God. That's why the last chapter of this book is about faith as the step we have to take. And people say, well, I don't want to profess faith because I have doubts. Good. If you didn't have doubts, faith wouldn't be required. If God were as obvious as the tree next to the tree in the yard, you wouldn't have to have faith. And without faith, you can't love him.
That's a great quote that you've reflected on many times from Tom Skinner, right?
Yeah, in fact, I don't know if you've heard Tom Skinner's quote, but Tom was chaplain of the Washington Redskins.
Oh, I knew Tom, sure.
For a number of years and had an impact in my life. And he gave me a quote. And it goes like this: I spent a long time trying to come to grips with my doubts, when suddenly I realized I'd better come to grips with what I believe. I have since moved from the agony of questions that I cannot answer to the reality of answers that I cannot escape. Wow. And it's a great relief.
Well, that's a great quote.
And what happened, Chuck, is Tom Skinner in that quote hit my life at a time of doubt, at a time of spiritual searching and seeking, like you're talking about in your book. And, you know, God works in mysterious ways to get our attention. And in fact, I kept reading your book and I kept saying, you know, Chuck's using all these tough circumstances, prisoners, people suffering unjustly, and your daughter, a single parent raising an autistic child. And I reflected back on just a couple of days ago of walking into a children's hospital in Little Rock, Arkansas, where there was a father who had, along with his wife, gone to have pizza with their 4 kids the night before. 6 o'clock, they're driving down the highway in northwest Arkansas, and a guy evidently goes to sleep at the wheel. They hit one another, both going 55 miles an hour. The mother, who was pregnant, 3 months pregnant at the time, was killed. The son in the back seat had both legs broken. The 7-year-old boy banged his head, and he was in Children's Hospital, having been airlifted there. And I stood beside his body, and I wept. I just wept. But I left that room to go back out to talk to a 28-year-old father who's now a widow. And I put my hand on his forearm, and his mother, who had flown in, was there, and they asked me to pray. And I thought later of the simplicity of that act of acknowledging that there is a God. That, you know what, we're not in charge, and he is. And I thought, what would someone who has no God, who has no faith, how would they walk into that waiting area?
You couldn't. What do you do in the waiting room if you don't know God is a great question. Dennis, that's very powerful. And I can really connect with it, because after this book was finished, just when it was finished, I was thinking, boy, my life is really, I got things together now. You know, this is good. I've got this book finished, and things are really going well. And I hear my son has spine cancer, 51 years old. And it was absolutely shattering. I think the hardest thing anybody can ever face is having a child whose life is in peril. 3 weeks later, my daughter, who's so precious to me, Emily, has a melanoma on her leg. So 2 out of 3 kids have cancer at the same time. Now, at first it was real tough because I thought, God, how could you let this happen to me? But eventually it hit me through a series of circumstances that this is part of living, that this is part of faith, that I'm a very visible public witness. How do I handle something as tough as this? And I also realized that if 2 years ago somebody had said to me, you're going to have 2 kids with cancer at the same time, I would have probably jumped off a bridge. I couldn't imagine that a pain that would be unbearable. And yet I've discovered stronger faith through it, and stronger faith with my daughter. My son, the one who has the cancer in the spine, is not a believer. He was a freshman at Princeton when I was converted, took a lot of razzing. He's got much more of a scientific mind, and he's been hard to get to. I think he's going to get there. But this is when your faith is put to a test. Is this faith real? You find that out in the hospital waiting room. And I found out it's real. I'm more convinced today of the reality of Christ than ever.
You know, it's interesting to hear you say that, because you're a very bright intellectual man, well-educated. You've continued to study the world religions throughout the scope of your life. And yet, as you move toward the last phase of your life, you're more convinced.
Oh, yeah, much
not
more.
less.
I remember many years ago hearing Malcolm Muggeridge. I don't know how many of our listeners will remember that name, but he was a great writer, a great journalist who converted late in life. And he said, I'm more convinced of the reality of Jesus Christ than I am of my own reality. And he was a colorful guy, white hair going all over the place, and he'd always have a wonderful chuckle. I was with him once for tea, and he was talking about this, and I thought, well, he's an old man. At that point, he was the same age I am now. And I think I said, this is a bit of hyperbole. You know, it isn't. The spiritual world actually animates the physical world. So I think it's right. I think we're more convinced of the reality of Christ than I am of my own reality. And the more I study, the more convinced I get.
You conclude your book talking about how the good life ultimately ends in death, which can result in new life. And throughout the book, you use illustrations of people who illustrate the good life positively and negatively. And as you talk about the end of a matter, that is death, you use 2 illustrations. One is a funeral you and I attended where Bill Bright was honored for his life. And another illustration you use was a funeral neither of us attended because there was none. John Ehrlichman, a Watergate figure. Just quickly contrast John's life with Bill's life.
Well, John Ehrlichman, I went back to see when he invited me to, when he was in a nursing home in Atlanta. Everything had collapsed in his life. He'd been through 3 marriages. His family abandoned him. He had nothing. He was penniless and powerless, one of the most powerful men in the world. And he wanted to see me because a doctor had told him he had renal failure. He was on a kidney dialysis. A doctor told him that he could get a shot of morphine and put himself out of misery. I was shocked. I spent an hour talking about the dignity of life and the meaning of life. I don't know whether it sank in or not. A friend of mine went back and prayed with him, and hopefully he received Christ. I'd like to think he did before he died. But he died alone in the nursing home with nobody around him, having given up on life. I can't think of a more despairing story. And I tell it as a tragic story because he was such a good man until the collapse came in his life. And we said earlier, what happens to you doesn't matter. It's how you react to what happens to you. Well, he reacted badly to what happened to him in the fall of Watergate. Contrast that with Bill Bright, and I remember being with you at the funeral, Dennis, and what a great experience that was. What a joyous day that was for Bill's celebration of his life. But Bill, when he learned he had pulmonary fibrosis, which is one of the most difficult ways to die, you're slowly suffocating, and it's agonizing death. And the doctor told him how bad it was going to be, and Bill said, praise the Lord, this is what God wants. Throughout that 2-3 year period that Bill knew he was dying, maybe the most productive period in his ministry, he wrote all kinds of things, did kinds of videos. I'd go see him in his apartment. He had the oxygen strapped to him. And he never was without a smile and always giving me ideas. And here's something you can do in the ministry, Chuck.
And us
he was an extraordinary man. And when he died, Vanette was with him and whispered to him, it's all right. And he turned his head and he died peacefully. And we have to know that if you're going to live a good life, it contemplates a good death. It contemplates facing it with equanimity because you know you're going to be with the Lord, and dying with grace to the extent you can. I mean, obviously, some people are in terrible pain. But Bill Bright set the gold standard for me.
He really did. He showed us how to live and how to die.
And how to die, yep.
There may be a man or a woman listening to this broadcast, perhaps a boy or a girl, who goes, you know what, it's time for me to have that faith experience that you talked about where you had to pull the car off to the side of the road and receive Christ. Would you explain to them what they need to do, just at their point where they are right now, of how they can connect with God and know they're forgiven all their sins?
It's maddeningly simple, and the problem with it is that people think, there's got to be more to that. I got to do some good works. I got to do something to show that I'm a good person. I'm really not. My life is a mess right now. I'll clean up my life first before I come to God. Wrong. You can't clean up your life. You're incapable of cleaning up your life, and God doesn't want you to even try. What he wants you to do is surrender, the humblest possible surrender. Get rid of your pride, which is the great enemy, and simply say, Lord Jesus, I want you in my life. Forgive me my sins. Let him worry about cleaning them up. When I came to him, I had a ton of sins, and there was some he could immediately erase. There's some he had to work on with me for a while. And that's part of the process of sanctification. It's a joint process between us and between God. But what it takes is a simple act of faith, recognizing that your doubts are a good thing. I loved what you said about Tom Skinner. That was a marvelous quote. Your doubts are a good thing, because if you didn't have doubts, you wouldn't take God seriously. And you wouldn't need God. We need him because he settles the question for us. And he's made it so easy for just us to turn to him as long as we are genuinely repentant and ask him to come in and take our lives.
And he'll take us out our word at that point and make us a new creation in Christ.
You know, people say, does God answer prayers? He answers the prayer of every single person who says, Jesus, take me.
And that puts you on the path for the good life, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
It does. And
That is the good life.
That's amazing. To me, the story of Chuck Colson is one of tremendous courage and definitely courageous faith. Here's a man who had achieved so much and was so full of himself and yet emptied himself and gave his life to Christ to go and work with prisoners and became a world leader in prison ministry. Chuck was a hero of mine. I don't know why he liked me, but I liked him, and we clicked, and we talked on numerous occasions. And as time went by, he had invited me to come to South Florida where he lived and have his, as I mentioned, his Chilean sea baths. But I begrudgingly say this, but I can't really say it that way. He had a more important appointment with God in heaven. He died. And he had just been with our speaker team that speaks at the weekend, remember, marriage getaways, about 50 couples there in South Florida. He had spoken to them and talked about going the distance in ministry and had their ultimate respect as a leader. And at over 80 years of age, he was still clicking on all 8 cylinders. There wasn't anything retired about him. He was a great leader and also a great friend. And I miss being able to call him and ask his opinion on things. I didn't do it often, but I did do it enough that he was a trusted source of wisdom and advice looking back on it. Chuck, as a fellow believer, was a hero of the faith, a true, courageous man of God who followed Christ all the way to the finish line. A lot of people were laughing at his conversion, really questioning it, but they didn't laugh for long because Chuck was so filled with credibility and authenticity that they couldn't deny what they had seen in his life. Chuck Colson, if you're listening in heaven, we miss you. But thanks for your work here. And thanks for ultimately being a guest on Inspiring Courageous Faith, which you demonstrated so well. And if you like this broadcast, I'd like to encourage you to like it, to subscribe, rate it, review it, share it with another believer or with a bunch of believers. I think his story needs to be told. There's a lot of people today who do not know who Chuck Colson is, and that's too bad because he was a true, remarkable hero of the faith. Thanks for joining us. Hope you'll be back again for another edition of Inspiring Courageous Faith.